You are.
Okay. I don't remember how to start this anymore, Chris. It's been too long. It's been like way too long. It's been
Yeah.
like, God, like a
I
month.
mean, however long it's been for you, it's been a lot longer for me. This is my first podcast appearance since I stopped doing my own podcast.
Oh, that's right. Idle thumbs. All right, we just have to
Mhm.
talk about that. But I'm going to do a quick intro.
Sure.
Welcome to the Dialogue Box. This is Gwen Frey, and I'm joined today with Chris Remo. Uh,
Hello.
hello. Um, let's talk about you, Chris, because you just mentioned that you used to have a podcast. You used to do this all the time, right?
I did. I was a regular podcaster for a decade. I started a podcast with Jake Rodkin and Nick Brecken in 2008 called Idle Thumbs, which was a weekly video game podcast that we did for many years and had other people involved on and off: Sean Vanneman, Danielle Riendo, James Spafford, and that is on sort of, I guess, indefinite hiatus at the moment, along with another podcast that we'd been doing for about a year called Important If True, which was a sort of absurdist comedy slash state of the insane technological world kind of discussion that we did for about a year. So that too is on some kind of indefinite, we don't know how to do this right now given the current state of our lives. So
Yeah.
this is my first podcast in over a year.
Oh man, that's
Hmm.
nuts. It's weird. It's usually I get somebody on here and have them like introduce themselves, but I have a feeling I mean I used to watch Idle Thumbs, so I can't imagine anybody not knowing who you are. So it's
Uh,
kind of funny.
I can definitely imagine people not knowing who I am. It's easy for me to imagine.
But yeah, you so you were on Idle Thumbs. You used to work back where were you before Campo Santo? I don't even remember.
Yeah, so I'm at Valve now. Before that, I was at Campo Santo, where we made Firewatch. Before that, I was at Double Fine for a few years. And then before that, I was at Irrational Games, where I think you and I very narrowly missed each other. I think you went to Irrational like almost immediately after I left. That's my understanding of that situation.
Yeah, there were big shoes to fill, and I didn't fill them. I was in the art team.
Yep,
They
they were unrelated shoes.
they were completely different shoes, man.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. So you've moved around a bit. So that was, you must have moved from Boston to San Francisco to work at Double Fine.
Well, I moved from San Francisco to Boston.
Mhm.
I was born in San Francisco, moved around a bunch as a kid, moved back to San Francisco, where I spent my entire adult life except for those couple of years in Boston, and then now in Seattle as of last year.
Got
So
it.
I was San Francisco. It's still to this day, most of my life has been spent in San Francisco.
That's where your heart, are you going to end
But
up back
eventually
there?
that will change. I don't think I will, which is
Mm.
sad for me. When I left San Francisco to take the irrational job in Boston, I remember, I was in my mid 20s, I guess, and it didn't it felt like a it was just kind of like a fun thing I was doing. I remember it didn't feel like a huge emotional wrenching move, and I didn't realize this at the time, but I think in retrospect, it's because I think deep down I must have known I was coming back eventually. Like I
Mhm.
never even got a new driver's, like I never got a Massachusetts driver's license, things like that. When I think back, I wasn't, again, this wasn't intentional or conscious, but when I think back, I'm like, oh yeah, I wasn't really permanently doing this, I guess, even though I thought I maybe was. Whereas last year when we left San Francisco with my wife, we I certainly realized, well, I'm never coming back here. It was really tough. It was a really, like, emotionally, it was very difficult, because I could tell this is a final move. I mean, whether or not I'm in Seattle for the rest of my life, that I have no idea, but um, I definitely know I won't be coming back to San Francisco, and it's not out of any lack of love or affection for it. It's just that it feels like an impossible place to return to at this point.
Oh,
Um,
wow. That's a deep statement, man. I
it's
still,
just unaffordable. I mean, I
yeah.
can't imagine any future in which I could, we had a great rent controlled apartment right on the corner of Golden Gate Park, and it was awesome. I mean, it was the best apartment I've ever had in my life. It was wonderful. But once we moved out, we gave up our rent control, and it's like, well, I can't get back in now. If I'd stayed there, that would have basically worked out. But you know, it felt permanent, and it was tough. It was a tough move.
Oh, that's rough, man. Yeah, I mean,
Oh, it's okay. I mean, we made the decision intentionally, but It was,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's hard for me because, like, in my head, San Francisco, there's a thing that San Francisco is, and it's kind of like this amazing place where I spent my early 20s. It's this perfect place. Every time I go back for GDC, it's like, oh, wow, that's not what it was.
yeah,
Like,
it's
10
tough.
years has changed that place.
Yeah, San Francisco is a complicated. It's a complicated place that been has always been changing and continues to, and the ways in which it changes tend not to be incredibly friendly to the people who were already there.
Yeah, that is true. Most of the people I knew when I was in San Francisco weren't from there. It's actually rare to meet somebody who's actually from there. It's kind of
Yeah,
cool.
I feel like that's true of most great cities, and I mean, that's something I like about them. I'm very much a city. I'm extremely a city person by disposition, and there is definitely something extremely wonderful and valuable about having deep roots in a place. Like there absolutely is, but there's also something to be said for what can for what results in a place where people are primarily there by choice from many different places. If anything, the difficulty, in my opinion, with places like San Francisco at this point is that people are from too similar. Like there's a bunch of people who aren't from there, but they're all kind of from similar other places that aren't there. Whereas what you really want in a great city is for lots of different people who aren't from there, but they're from many different places.
Yeah, but you can say
That's
the
what
same
makes a
thing
great
about
city.
Seattle's the same way, right? Like everyone, the Seattle, Austin, San Francisco triangle
Hmm.
is
Yeah,
very strong. I feel like they just move around between those three cities a lot.
yeah. You could add Portland in there as kind of a like the cheaper
Portland's
alternative.
trying.
No, Portland's great. I mean, all those places that you said are great, but there's just this pattern that's kind of happening to all mid-sized American cities right now. Like I feel
Yeah.
like that triangle you said, I think you could extend that to at least mid-sized coastal uh, American cities. Certainly, it's challenging. I don't think those places have figured out how to deal with the trends that are going on.
That's interesting. How was your move to Seattle, like in general? Were you
Oh,
able
it's
to
really good.
handle? I mean, the weather there is awful, right? You've been there a year.
No, everyone like declares that, but I feel like that is more of like a meme um, than anything I've found to be borne out in any kind of extreme way. I mean, it rains, but it doesn't rain torrentially. It mists a lot, it drizzles a lot. The weather is sort of crisp and chilly more than cold, which I like. I like being able to wear, a coat, like a real coat. The weather is not it's honestly pretty similar to San Francisco, and I would describe San Francisco weather as essentially my perfect weather, which is it's relatively moderate most of the year. The difference is the winters are tougher here, but not in an extreme way, not compared to Boston. Like
No, no, the winters
it's
here are worse. I mean, the difference is for some people it affects people differently, but for me,
yeah.
Seattle, it's the lack of sun, right?
Yeah, you
Like,
get into those winter long nights for sure. Yeah, totally. That is a thing.
well, yeah. So you moved up to Seattle.
Yep.
You perfectly adapted to the weather. How about
Hmm.
Valve? What's it like going from like Campo Santo? Because we should probably explain this because not everybody knows this, right? Like you
Yeah.
worked,
There's no reason people would know this. Yeah.
yeah. So you worked at Campo Santo and
Yeah, we
Camp.
were. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. You can explain it better than I can.
Sure. So yeah, Campo Santo was a small, roughly 10-person studio in San Francisco, and the studio came together, pretty much explicitly to make a game called Firewatch, which we did release in 2016, um, which was I mean, I would say that was the most rewarding game project I've ever worked on. It worked with really great people, some of whom I'd already known for many years, some of whom I'd worked with at studios like Double Fine. Um, and then in early last year, we became part of Valve, and because Valve, unlike most companies of Valve's sort of stature, I guess, they only have one office. Valve has one office in the Seattle area, and if you work at Valve, you pretty much work out of that office. And so we all relocated from San Francisco to Seattle, or Bellevue technically is where Seattle is, or where Valve is located, but I personally live in Seattle. Um, and yeah, it's like 35 times as many people as Campo Santo. So it's a very different scale, but it's interesting because there are projects at within Valve that span team sizes ranging all the way from like half a dozen people up to, 30, 40, 50 people.
Oh, all right. I
Um,
want to get into all of this, but let's start with like the we're after Firewatch. What happened? Did you think like, oh, we want to be hired by Valve, or were you? I mean,
no,
obviously, you're spinning up a new game, right?
yeah, it just kind of honestly, it wasn't like any kind of plan or I mean, there's really like no way to explain it other than just Valve approached us at a certain point and asked if we were interested, and we were extremely surprised. Like there wasn't any strategic planning to sort of try and encourage something that like we hadn't even it hadn't even occurred to us that that was a thing that could happen, let alone something that we were seeking. It was just it was a totally for us a totally out of left field proposal that was unexpected. But when we started talking to them about it, it was like, oh, this actually could be really interesting. I mean, I was a before I was a game developer, I was a game journalist. Uh, Ages ago, like 15 years ago at this point, which is terrifying. And um, I was the editor in chief of a site called Shack News, which is traditionally very much a sort of PC forward, uh, you know, site that it was originally founded in the mid 90s as a Quake blog, essentially. And so it had deep roots in that whole sort of scene. And Half Life was also directly came out of that entire kind of scene and engine and everything. And so, um, because of that, I had just sort of always, not always, but I'd for a while kind of just known some people, some folks at Valve, like Robin Walker, who was one of the people who made the original Team Fortress and has been at Valve ever since then, and just some other cool folks who worked there. So I'd always kind of like a few of us at Campo sort of had these loose ties to some people at Valve and were familiar with the studio and kind of the way that they work a bit and some people there. So that I think definitely made it easier for us when they came to us with this idea to be a bit more like I guess to come to a decision maybe more quickly than we would have otherwise, because a lot of us just had sort of pre-existing associations. And I will say though that the having those pre-existing associations did not necessarily make it less surprising what it actually feels like to work at Valve.
I will say, oh yeah, I was just gonna say
Yeah.
like we
Oh,
were
go ahead.
all
Yeah.
surprised when Valve, because
Yeah,
it's been
we were
a
too.
long time since Valve bought a company. That really, we were all like, what? Valve is buying companies again? Because I think the rest of us are in a mindset where so much of when you talk about Valve, you think about Steam, right? Like you've, and obviously Valve makes games, but you don't really think about those. When you think about Valve, you think about Steam. To me, at least.
I mean, I think that that's true for a lot of people. I mean, I think that's the case. I mean, I guess a few responses to all that stuff. I mean, there's sort of an infinite amount of stuff you can talk about when it comes to game development. It goes on forever. But the I completely what was I saying right before
Oh, you were
what
talking
you
about
said?
the way how you weren't prepared for how much Valve changed,
Oh,
like the culture
oh,
shock, probably, or
yeah, kind of. It's more so actually this relates to what you're saying as well. I guess the thing that I hadn't really occurred to me is just how many things go on inside of Valve. So it's a company of like I don't know, a little over 300 people or so. I don't know what the exact count is. And that's big, but like there are AAA game teams that are multiple times that size, right?
yeah.
Like an Assassin's Creed team is 2 to 3 times, as far as I'm aware, that. But within Valve, there are multiple game teams. There's Steam. There are hardware teams. There are like full-time video production people. I mean, there are so many different projects
Wait,
going
full time
on.
video production people.
Yeah, like they made that movie about I'm not a super clued in Dota person, so don't ask me to like
Oh, I
talk about
see.
this in detail, but there was like that whole Dota documentary. And as far like again, I'm not super connected to this, but
I
as far
had
as
to
I'm aware, that
assume.
was made essentially within Valve by those folks. Don't quote me on this in case I'm getting some detail of it wrong, but yeah, I mean, there's people doing like a huge range of stuff inside Valve, and that was something I had never personally encountered at a single studio before. I mean, typically those would be things where you work for the game studio and then the game studio is owned by or has a relationship with a publisher. And then that publisher has a bunch of other subsidiaries or what have you, and they do a bunch of different things. And maybe they're owned by a holding company, and then that holding company owns
Yeah.
other companies that do different things. But at Valve, it's like it's a relatively small for a company that does as much as it does. It's relatively small in terms of like it has one office and a few hundred employees, but it just does all that stuff in house, and it's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
It was a shocking, not shocking in a negative way, but it was just a surprising thing to encounter. Like, oh yeah, I mean, if I in theory wanted to learn I mean, I would have to probably have like an interesting idea here, but like if I wanted to learn a lot more and get a lot better at video production, I could probably just do that inside of Valve because there are other extremely knowledgeable, experienced people doing it, and I could, learn from them and move my desk over to their zone and like help out with what they're doing and try to use, whatever skills I have to help them out, and then in the meantime, sort of absorb some of the stuff that they have. So like I've gotten
Are you
to be a
encouraged to
much
do
better
that?
programmer. Yeah, yeah. Like I've become a much better programmer since being at Valve. So actually this is something I'm curious to talk about with you. Like my whole career in video game development has always been extremely multidisciplinary. So I don't have a background, like I don't have any educational background in anything related to game development, particularly. And so everything that I know and do and practice regarding um, the things that I personally do, which include game design, writing, music composition, web development, like some scripting and programming. That stuff is all stuff that I learned on the job, just from the various places I've worked and projects I've done outside of work. And so like because of that, I have this sort of intense combination of interest in lots of different parts of the game making process, which I think aids me as a game designer in particular, but also like crippling insecurity about not being a sort of multi computer science degreed, brain genius when it comes to some of these skills. And it's interesting being at Valve because you have both kinds of people there. I mean, there are people who are just mega like publishing SIGGRAPH paper caliber, engineers doing deep level engine work that I could just never even begin to touch. And then you have people with that much more those much broader skill set, and then everything in between.
Yeah.
So yeah, there is a lot of opportunity to sort of grow your own skill set.
And the grass is always greener, right? Like, because you
Mm.
touched on it, but if you're a tech artist or a journalist at a studio, you do certain things that other people can't do. But it's hard to realize that or recognize that, especially because at any given time, you'll be in a room and you'll be like, I'll make something and I'll explain to somebody how I did it, and I'm talking to somebody who's done like maybe technically way deeper systems. Like you're
Yeah.
never the expert, but you need somebody who understands the seams in between everything. It's really important. It's the moments like the when you open the door in BioShock Infinite and the light comes in and the birds fly away and all that. Somebody has to be the one that says like
That's important.
yeah, like that knows how to do a little bit of everything and knows how to
Yeah,
just get
totally.
that experience. And so I think the journalist stuff is important in large studios. It's way more important in smaller studios.
Hmm.
And
Definitely. Yeah.
Valve sounds like I don't know. Valve's just crazy. I think Valve is one of the lower turnover rates of like
I'm
most
sure
places.
that's true. I'm sure. Yeah, that is. I don't know what any of the statistics are, but I would be shocked if that weren't true. Yeah, and to your point about studio, how generalists versus specialists have different, almost relative value within smaller and bigger studios. I mean, I highly agree with you for sure. I mean, I basically went from, going from Irrational to Double Fine to Campo. I went from kind of full scale AAA, right, to I would say large indie. Double Fine was, and I think still is, about 60 people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, to Campo, which was about 10 of us. I think we maybe reached maybe a dozen, like including contractors at times. Um, and definitely, I mean, part of it I think is that I got more experienced and improved my skill set, but also the smaller the team, the more important and useful you can be as a generalist. And so being at Valve is interesting in the sense that it kind of contains teams of all those different sizes. Um, so, so that kind, like, you can sort of slot into, I guess, places where you can be more or less useful. Like for instance, like I worked on Dota Underlords for a bit, which is like, here's an example, I guess, of, like, here's a game Valve actually released recently that I think is like counter to the narrative that Valve doesn't make games like as much anymore, which is honestly like kind of an opinion that I sort of had before joining Valve. But now that I'm there, I'm like, oh, we actually ship stuff a lot.
Yeah.
It's just like across just sort of I guess sort of a broader swath of types of things. But like Dota Underlords came out a few months ago, and I worked on that for a while, kind of in part to like help myself grow. Like I was writing C++ code, which is not like I had never checked C++ code into a shipping project before, right? Like I had written C sharp for with Unity, and Lua at Double Fine, but C++ feels like, again, as sort of a non-computer science person, C++
So
just like feels like scary and weird.
yeah,
But yeah, it was.
were you like a technical designer or were you a programmer? I was just wondering.
um, well, on that in particular, I was doing a bunch of like UI implementation and stuff.
Ah,
Um, uh, I mean, that's a game where most of the game, as far as the user is concerned, is UI, right? Like I don't know if you're familiar with the game at all, but it's a game where you sort of like pick a bunch of units and then put them on a board, and then your board of units fights the enemy's little army of units automatically. But most of what you're doing is like buying stuff from a store and choosing which units you're going to use and upgrading your stuff and things like that. So most of what you're doing is pushing buttons and dragging things around. So like most of the sort of player input in that game is UI. So there's just a lot of stuff to do in terms of UI implementation and design. So I was doing that, basically a combination of design and implementation of like UI stuff.
and that's what you were doing at Valve, right? But before that, when you were doing
Oh,
like Unity and Lua stuff at Double Fine, what was your actual role?
well, so Double Fine so here's an example of what I mean by like the sort of generalist, the smaller team you get, right? So at Double Fine, I was like different things per project. So
I see.
I wrote a game with Ron Gilbert called The Cave, which was a kind of side-scrolling puzzle platformer game. It was like a traditional graphic adventure game, like Ron Gilbert's older games, like Monkey Island, but in a side-scrolling platformer format, kind of. And so he and I wrote that game together. So that was like script writing, and then that bleeds into narrative design, because when writing and implementation of writing in a game is inevitably also a design, um, an issue of design. And then I also did the soundtrack to a game at Double Fine called Space Base DF9. And then I was also a designer on the original prototype of Space Base DF9. So that involved design work and Lua scripting, to implement both the music and other design elements of the game. Um, so
Jesus, you do
so it's
have a
like,
that is a broad skill set, man. You are like a
well,
renaissance man.
you must have a broad skill set because you made an entire game by yourself, which I want to talk about as soon as I finish talking about
Uh,
this. And so then, but my point is that and then, I also did a bunch of web development at Double Fine. So like I made the website that we used to manage backers of Broken Age Kickstarter campaign. So like we had a whole website that that allowed us to sort of like manage all your rewards and stuff after the Kickstarter campaign was no longer running. Like once the Kickstarter campaign is done, you can't like you don't have as many features from it anymore. So we made a whole internal website that we use to manage all that stuff. And I worked with like a back end database programmer guy on that, and I did all of the design and front end programming on that site. But so it's almost like on each of those projects that I worked on, I was sort of doing a different thing. Whereas this is my point about the smaller the team gets on Firewatch at Campo Santo, I was doing all those things on the same project, right? So like I was on the I was on the kind of story like writers room kind of. There were like three or four of us who were the sort of writers room who worked through the story beats and plot and narrative design questions. And then my like on the daily basis I was primarily a game designer, which meant implementing the gameplay and narrative into the game with our custom tools that our programmers wrote, as well as I did some amount of gameplay programming on various systems. And then I was also the composer, so I wrote and recorded all of the music for the game, which I also implemented myself. And then I also sort of ended up being the I ended up being the sound designer, which was something I had not done before, and uh, that was that was kind of something like, oh, I've worked with audio. I guess I'll do the sound design. You know, it was so we worked with some external sound designers, and then increasingly on the project, I ended up doing a lot of that myself as well, and then I did all of the implementation of that sound design. And so the thing that I really took from that experience was of doing all those different things in a single project was game design is also all of those things. Like I I think that I don't know that this is necessarily obvious to a player necessarily. Um, and if it's not, it's fine. It's not meant to be showy at all. But like the music was like being the person who both was a game designer but also the composer and implementing the music. I was able to implement the music in a bunch of cases in reactive ways using the game systems subtly to try and tie in with the narrative design. And that's something that like I've done other game soundtracks for other games in the past. Like I did the soundtrack to Gone Home, for instance, and that was something that and this is not a negative point at all. It's just how it worked. Like that was a thing where I worked with Steve Gaynor, the designer of the game, and we went back and forth and kind of figured out what we wanted to do for the music. But when a given track was done, I just handed it over, and then Steve or whoever on the team would implement it. And then if we needed to do revisions, it would go back. But like it was very much deliverables, you know, like we'd work together on what we needed. But then when I had the asset, you know, you deliver the asset, they implement it. Um, and that's often how it works with composers. But on Firewatch, being serving both of those roles myself meant I really understood what the game systems were and what they needed and how that would play into these other parts of the game that I was also working on. And so I ended up also writing like a music manager that was doing like observing player behavior in certain areas and then triggering music appropriately and being the person responsible for both parts of that, the system and the assets, I think was hugely beneficial. And again, like I don't know if that necessarily like sold additional copies of the game. It definitely, I'm sure it didn't. But just for me personally, as both a designer and a composer, I was really happy. Like it
Mm-hmm.
was, I just learned a ton about game design because I think game design connects to every single other part of the game. And the more you can understand holistically all the different parts of the game, I think the better served you are with it. And so to your point, or sorry, to you, like you did literally all that stuff except for the soundtrack. You did all of the stuff on your game. So I would imagine that all the stuff I just said is exactly what you were thinking about every single day, presumably.
Yeah, I mean the cohesion is really important. I think like the you touched on a lot of things that are really cool, and it reminded me like last night I was playing Death Stranding, and the music rolled in, and when the music rolls in has such an emotional impact. And the fact that there's certain like barks lines that somebody would say in the world, but it was scripted so they would only happen at certain moments in the music, so it
Hmm.
didn't like stomp on each other and stuff
Oh,
like that.
totally. Yeah. That's,
That's
yep.
like masterfully done. I think having an eye for that is so important and so good. I wish like for a game about kind is about these musicians that are getting together. So you would think there'd be more
Hmm.
focus in the music than there was. But I'm actually not a musician, and I worked with Mitchell and I did the best I could to integrate that. But I didn't do the music for kind. I think that's hella impressive. In all seriousness.
That's that's so interesting that you're not a musician because when I like playing Kine, it feels like I mean it feels like it was made by someone who at the very least cares deeply about music. Like I would have assumed from playing that game that you were a musician of some sort because the game feels like it cares a lot about music and musicians.
Well, I mean, I always, every game I've worked on actually, for some reason, tends to have a really strong soundtrack. I generally like it because I come from an art background, and usually the music I'm listening to when I make something is extremely important and changes it. And
Mm-hmm.
it's important to me, like the way I get in the zone to make certain things is I have to have a
Mm-hmm.
good soundtrack. And when I started Kine, I was the genesis behind it at the very beginning was I was like really obsessed with La La Land, that film.
I was gonna say it's very La La Land.
Yeah, you could tell. Like it was like a fan. It was like if I'm a game developer that was a fan of La La Land, wanting to make a puzzle game, and this is like how it ended up being. So yeah, I at the time I remember I was really frustrated. How do you put it? We could talk about what happens in between projects because I am curious
I'm
how
so
you.
frustrated I didn't say La La Land before you did because now that you already said it, it feels like it was just I could be bullshitting you, but that was like literally what I had in my head most of the time when I was playing it.
Oh, that's beautiful. That worked then. Yeah,
Hmm.
I did love that film a lot, and I know at the time I tend to get into these funks between games when you're trying to figure out what to do next, and you're like looking up the mountain, trying to figure out like what you're gonna do next after you've just finished a project, and I tend to get into a funk where I'll do. You try to become the market whisperer. You just like
Yeah, it's
everything's been
impossible.
done.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
there's nothing you can do that
I
hasn't already
know,
been
right?
done.
Oh
There's nothing
God,
that being a game developer is probably a stupid thing to be. The only thing stupider than trying to be a game developer is trying
it's
to be a
pretty dumb.
musician,
Yeah.
right?
Oh no, that's true. I can literally tell you a story about that. So I was a music major in college. I went to UC Berkeley and got a music degree because I was an idiot. And it was literally because I played in bands and stuff in high school. And when I went to college, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, or like I didn't. I just did. I was like intensely unambitious at that age, and I just didn't have any clue.
So,
And I
that's
was like,
okay. It
I
worked
like
out.
music. I was like, I played in bands, and I was like, I like music. I'll do music. That was like the decision. And then in the music major, I was with all these people who, are like concert level pianists and unbelievable sort of opera singers and all, people who had been practicing their performance craft deeply since like age 5. And I was like, what? Like, shit, this is more hardcore than I expected. And anyway, I remember so that experience really taught me don't try and become a professional musician. Not that no one should, but that I shouldn't, because I'm like, I'm not like better than these people. Are you shitting me? This is ridiculous. So I'm like, well, I definitely would not succeed if I tried to become a professional musician because I'd be competing against like infinite other people who are all like in the league of these other people. But anyway, the point that is actually like relevant to what you were just saying, even though I know you meant it as kind of a joke, was I remember there was a career fair at my school, and the university printed out these brochures that um, had listed all the different majors for all the different concentrations, that the school offers, and they ranked them by percentage of graduates of that degree who ended up finding a job in the field in which their degree was earned. And music was, I'm not exaggerating, in last
Oh,
place.
of
Of
course.
every single major at the entire school, which UC Berkeley is a big school, I think there were 20,000 undergraduates there. So there are a lot of different majors. There are a lot of different things you can study at that school. It's a big, big university. and music was the worst. Out of all of them, if you wanted to actually have a professional career in the thing that you studied, that is the worst possible choice you could make. So that was another thing that was like, okay, maybe I should figure out something else to do in my life, because I don't think I'm going to be one of like this tiny percentage that figures that out.
No, it's I totally get it. I didn't know what I wanted to do either. When I graduated, keep in mind, like I didn't get the game magazines and stuff from stores when I was a kid. I got my
Hmm.
brother's hand me downs for games, so I didn't realize you could be a game developer. Like that didn't even occur to me
Yeah, I didn't really ever think
until
about that either.
like I loved video games, played them constantly, and had no idea you could do that for a living. So I went to school. I had amazing grades. I could have gone anywhere. And for some reason, I was like, my parents brought me to Disney World too many times when I was a kid. And I was like, I'm going to be an animator.
Oh, that's cool.
So I went to school for animation. And then
Nice.
when I was there, I almost failed out because I was playing World of
Oh,
Warcraft so
wow.
much. And I started, I was the only artist at RIT, really. There, well, not the only one, but
Oh,
like,
interesting. That's kind of
there's
surprising.
RIT is like it's a programming school, right? Like
Okay, sure.
nobody goes there to major in fine art. I don't know
I
if they
see. I see.
have like a fine art. I mean, I'm sure they do, but nobody goes to RIT to major in fine art. And so, a bunch of nerds got together and wanted to have a game dev like after school thing, like a club
Hmm.
that makes video games.
Uh-huh.
And it was all programmers, and I was the only artist there, and it was
That's kind
great.
of good position to be in, though, right?
Yeah, it's like the opposite of the real world, right? You can never get a programmer.
Right. I know. God, yeah, they're precious, precious resources.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I don't remember. I don't know how we get back to like normal conversation, but
Yeah.
I kind of stumbled around. I stumbled around too. I just kind of stumbled into game development as well. Maybe not quite as meandering a path as you did,
Yeah,
which
mine
is
was extremely meandering. Um, I didn't have any. I mean, I'm gonna say this continues to this day. I've never really known like what I want to do when I grow up.
yeah,
Like it's never been something that I'm actually really envious of people who have their whole lives had some kind of overriding goal and passion. It's not that I'm not passionate about things. I am like extremely. I mean, I think one of my defining sort of maybe annoyingly defining characteristics is that I am extremely passionate about things like about ideas and like creative works and things and people and so on. I but I have I've never really had an overriding like I must personally myself do this thing and achieve this. I've just never had that, and so I kind of ended up in. I mean, obviously, my career has been extremely fortunate, and I've learned a ton, and I appreciate it in a million ways. But I didn't come to it from a starting point of like I need to make games. This is what I need to do. Like that's I'm going to do whatever it takes to do that. And the fact that I ended up doing that is bonkers to me because I really it was a very odd nonlinear path, and sometimes when students or other aspiring game developers ask me how I how I got into this career or what if I have any advice for them, I'm just like, oh man, I don't know. Don't use my thing as
yeah.
like any kind of template because it won't work guaranteed.
You can't
Like
follow this. You do the thing that makes the
no,
most sense or is the most interesting at any given time, and that kind of
yeah,
moves you. And you like a pachinko machine. You end up somewhere maybe not even
yep,
where you expected, right?
totally.
That's
I would, yeah,
yeah. That's how
I
my
would
life
say
has been as
if
well.
there's yeah, exactly, yeah. I would say if there is any one thing that I would like reproduce from my path that I do think was maybe the one thing that I did that actually has had a tangible outcome, even though it wasn't intentional at the time, um, is form and maintain strong creative partnerships early and keep them. Like the indirectly the reason that I'm a game developer now is because I co-founded a website called Idle Thumbs, which years later became the podcast Idle Thumbs that I mentioned earlier. But originally it was like a video game website with a bunch of other folks, including Jake Rodkin, who ended up being also a co-host of the podcast with me, and a bunch of other mainly British folks actually that we all of whom we met each other online, basically on online forums. And I now have worked with Jake professionally at two different game studios, including Valve. We hosted a podcast together for 10 years. We co-founded Idle Thumbs, the company, together. Um, Steve Gaynor, who designed Gone Home, was an early contributor to the Idle Thumbs website. I still have the email that he sent us applying to write for Idle Thumbs, um, and I ended up composing the soundtrack for one of his games a decade later. Nick Brecken is someone who I hired at Shack News when I was editor in chief there, and he also became an original co-host of Idle Thumbs. He and I have now written games together. We co-wrote the Star Wars X-wing, like Rogue One X-wing VR game for PlayStation VR, and we've worked on other writing projects together. These are all people who none of us formed those friendships for utilitarian or careerist reasons. In fact, all of those people I became friends with before any of us were professional video game developers.
Mm.
But they were all people who I clearly, well, obviously I liked them a lot, but also identified with their sensibility. I mean, like, to me, sort of creative sensibility is one of the most important things in this entire field, is like understanding your own sensibility and working with people who share your sensibility, um, and maintaining those connections for, in some cases, in the case of Jake, who goes back with me the farthest of all those people, going back like 18 years now, I think. Uh, that has been a huge, massive asset in my career, but it's not something I did like intentionally, but looking back, it's like that's what I would definitely, if anyone was trying to reproduce any element of my path, I would say that was the part that was valuable. That still continues to be like amazingly valuable to this day.
Yeah, I'll bet. I mean, I think that's pretty universal. I think
I'm sure.
the advice I usually give people when I go to college or colleges or whatever, the like, what's your one piece of advice? 'Cause, like, as if you can distill it
Yeah,
all down to
I
one.
know, right? Yeah.
But it's always don't be an asshole. Like the most
That
important
helps.
thing. Like it's
Yeah,
the opposite of that, but it's like don't be the person where somebody that people want to work with, you know?
totally.
Be the person that other people think about when they're like, "Oh, I want to do something cool. Should I call?" You know, you want it to be you. Don't be the asshole. Don't write people off cuz nobody just disappears, right? We This industry is
Yeah,
surprisingly small.
it's
We all
very
move
true.
around.
Yeah,
And if
very
you
true.
find somebody you can work well with, you want to work with them again because they're for various reasons. Like some people just work well together, and some people are going to be good people, but you don't work well together because you're in, like you just work differently. Maybe you work in bursts, whereas they need to work in like 8 hours a day or something. Not all people work together in a compatible way. Sometimes people have different sensibilities or just wildly different interests, and you just can't find the Venn diagram of where you overlap. But if you find people that you work together well, just boosting them up and hanging out around with them and working with them continuously. I think the best work tends to come from teams that have worked together for a really long time.
Hmm. I
Um,
think that's totally true, and I think being a good collaborator and a good team member is definitely, I, I I mean, at the end of the day, it's ultimately, I think, more important strictly than just raw skill. Obviously, skill and experience and competence are important, but if you, I mean, if I could work with someone who was a little bit less purely skilled than someone else, but who I actually felt really comfortable collaborating with every day, I would definitely work with that person over the more difficult but also more skilled person. I mean, the sense of, I mean, certainly for me, the sense of almost like safety and security you get from someone who you can be creatively honest and productive with is so incredibly important. And
yeah.
no matter how talented someone is, if it's like a slog to work with them, or if you have to constantly be doing all this like work inside your own brain to like
It
play the
doesn't.
situation
It
correctly so that you don't
yeah.
create problems, like, oh my god, it's a nightmare.
It doesn't matter how strong they row if they're rowing in the wrong direction.
Yeah,
Like it just
that's
doesn't
a
matter.
much better way to put it.
I
Yeah.
mean the for business this is obviously like even more true, right? Like the I needed I could not port the game to Stadia myself. I had to hire a company to do that. This is a
Sure,
piece
that makes
of
sense. Yeah.
this is a untested platform. I don't know what Vulkan means. Like I'm pretty
Right.
sure that's
Yeah.
like I don't know anything about this shit. And so for when I was the only reason I could approach Google about the Stadia thing and to get kind into Stadia was because I had an old friend Elmore that I've worked with for like God 6 years. He was the tech director at Irrational back in the day. Do you know
Mm,
Elmore?
yep.
Steve Elmore?
Totally. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We were definitely both there at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah, so we just went to Google together and he just did the port, right? Like,
Nice. That's awesome.
yeah, it
Yeah.
was like a really good thing. And this happens constantly, right? Like
Hmm.
the people I work with or the deals I get are because I've worked with them in the past in game development somewhere.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, like there's sort of the notion, you know, it's who you know. There are ways in which that can be bad and frustrating, when it's exclusionary and bad, but there are also ways in which it's there are positive elements to that in the sense that if you know people and you acquit yourself well with them and they remember you fondly and liked working with you, that's a really positive thing. Like that's a good reason to work with someone because you're not going to make someone's life shittier by
Mhm.
being around them. Like
Yeah,
if they can trust that you're a good person to work with, like that's a positive thing.
yeah. And wrapping it back to San Francisco, I think the one of the critiques I would give about San Francisco is that because there is a lot of it's an area that's funded by a lot of venture capital, right? And there's a lot of
Yep,
teams there.
totally.
And I feel like everybody is really eager to get on the new big thing, like the MMOs or free to play or these people just got a $6 million round of funding or whatever.
Hmm.
And people move around really quickly to get options and stuff. And you don't spend the time to work with people for a long time. I really truly believe if you get a group of people working together for a longer time, that's when you're more likely to get a really quality game.
I'm sure that's true. I mean, on that San Francisco note, I remember there's something that I always uh, when we were a small independent developer in San Francisco, people, you run into someone and they ask what you do. It's like, oh, I make video games. Like, oh, you're in the tech industry. And it's like, we're not in the tech industry. That
Yeah.
is not the same thing. Like being in San Francisco and working for a company that makes software, which is what video games are. It's an amazing reminder. Like this is not the tech industry. Like the tech
Yeah.
industry is crazy startups with massive growth intention funded by VCs, or they're big established public companies that started out as that other kind of thing and now are operating at this insane scale. And I mean there just isn't really an equivalent of that in games. I mean there are probably uh some companies that are kind of similar to that. But generally speaking, like when you and I, people like us, talk about game developers in the games industry, they're not like that. They're either kind of just small to mid-sized companies that are owned by publishers and kind of tick along and are not crazy growth companies. They kind of have whatever team size they have, or they're independent developers that are basically small businesses. Like they're basically just getting by on an ongoing basis, and getting funding to do a project, but they're not VC funded. They're not looking for explosive growth because there isn't any version of scale in that way with a video game. Like you can't scale up like you can scale up a social media idea. Like there just isn't an equivalent of that. Like you're making an entertainment product, you're making a creative product. It's only at the end of the day it's going to appeal to a certain number of people whose taste likes that thing, but there's no version of it where you make something that's going to be as big as Facebook or Twitter or anything. And so when people, being in San Francisco, you're super conscious of the difference between what it means to be in video games versus what it means to be in tech. Also, another big difference, the salaries. They're not the same. It's actually like, despite the fact that a lot of the same skills are in use, there's not, at least in my time at two different independent studios in San Francisco, there was very, very little crossover between tech people and games people. We had one programmer at Campo, Patrick Ewing, who's great, who was an early Twitter employee, and he was a programmer on Firewatch, and that now he has his own studio. He made a game called NeoCab that came out about
Oh
a month
yeah,
ago.
cool.
But other than that, that was the only person I ever worked with in San Francisco who was a tech person. Everyone else was a games person. Like
Oh, I
Patrick took a
saw.
big pay cut to work on Firewatch. Like if you're a tech person, you're not going to go work at a video game studio because you're probably going to cut your salary in half.
No, no programmer would do it, but you see it the other way around though. Like
Oh, do
I
you?
used to see designers leaving games.
No, that's different.
Yeah,
You can leave games to go to tech, but you do that because you get paid better.
like
But what I'm
shit
saying,
tons more money.
but that's not interchange. That's like an exodus. Like when I say games and tech are different, I mean like they're not. If they were the same industry, you'd have people moving back and forth and kind of like they would both be sort of like in the mix. But no, it's not. It's like you work in games because you want to, then you leave to go to tech because you actually get paid reasonably well. But they're not, but they're different. It's like you're not moving in between, you're leaving one and going, okay, I'm done with this bullshit. Time to just have a normal life now. So, I
Yeah.
mean, maybe it's a point, maybe it's a minor distinction, but like, I remember people mistaking games for tech a lot in San Francisco, but I'm like, I don't ever, that doesn't ever feel like it to me. Like, I don't feel like I'm working in the tech industry. I feel like I'm working in a crazy, like, small business entertainment world, you know?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, Double Fine is a unique thing in San Francisco, and so is Campo Santo. I don't think
Didn't
there's,
used to be. Didn't used to be. There used to be a bunch of studios like that,
then they all
but
went
they've
to
all been
tech.
squeezed out again because of tech. Like,
There's so
the,
much money there, and you can't
yeah.
afford to live in San Francisco on like a game dev salary.
No, not unless you're grandfathered in. I mean, that was a big challenge Campo had, right? Like a bunch of most of us at Campo, I think, lived in the city of San Francisco, but it's because we were grandfathered in, like we were already there.
Mm.
But it was really difficult to hire someone at Campo and relocate them to San Francisco because they're like, what? Like, holy crap, this place is expensive. And if you're already there, it's okay because you know you're already paying the rent that you got years ago when you got an apartment you could afford, and so you're just kind of like grandfathered in. But it's really hard to move people to that
Well,
from a normal place.
the upside of that is that you guys pioneered some pretty incredible like remote team stuff, right? Like Benson was in the
Yeah,
UK, and you guys
yeah.
had,
James Benson, Ollie Moss, Nels. They were both in the UK, and then Nels Anderson was in Vancouver.
and you guys, I'm trying to remember, were you guys the first ones that did the always on camera thing?
I mean, we thought of it, which maybe other people thought of it simultaneously. I don't know, but we didn't get that idea from other people. What's funny actually is the reason we did that, the way we came up with that is on Idle Thumbs. Idle Thumbs was a podcast, and like most podcasts, it was funded by sponsor ads and sponsorships, and we would always test the. Actually, we like we be if our ad rep brought us a thing that they wanted us to advertise, we would always use it first to make sure that we were comfortable recommending it. I mean, obviously it was still paid ads, but like we wanted to make sure that we weren't recommending something that was that we actually thought was just bad. So Zoom, the video conferencing software, was a sponsor for Idle Thumbs for a few episodes. And so we're like, okay, well, I guess we'll just try it out at Campo Santo, to see if it's good software. And it turned out it was great. We're like, oh wow, this is the good one. This is the good version of this. And so because of that, it was like we had not heard of it before, but because of that Idle Thumb sponsorship, we it ended up giving us this idea for this like always on remote setup. So at Campo, every single one of us had a webcam on our monitor, and we're running this video conferencing software all the time. So in the corner of our screen, we always had a grid of everyone at the studio. So whether you were in the main studio, which was about 2/3 of us, or whether you were remote, which was about a third, every single individual face was still represented on the grid equally.
That's still some big brother shit, man. Like I
I
don't
know.
want to,
I
like
mean,
I don't.
you could always turn it off if you wanted. We weren't, but we did like it to be there so that the remote people didn't feel excluded.
Yeah, I mean, I get the reasons for it. I don't know. I mean, I don't have a solution. We're
Yeah,
reaching the end of this
it's hard.
podcast, so I can't get into like the advantages and disadvantages of different ways of working remote, because it is definitely like it's hard not to have an A team and a B team when you have one group that's definitely in a
Yeah,
studio
no, it's
together and
true.
goes to
It's a
lunch
real
together,
challenge,
and
definitely.
yeah. There's
So we would, I mean, we would try and fly those folks out, schedule, obviously schedule permitted. I mean, Jay Benson had a family or, continues to, has a family, has kids. And so you can't just like be flying people in and out constantly. But yeah, you're totally right. No matter how good your working practices are, if most people are in the office and some people are remote, there's definitely a vibe. There's like, it's just hard. It is impossible to truly 100% make the remote people uh as there as the people who are physically there. Um we did our best. I think we did a pretty good job, but yeah, it's never going to be perfect.
the one time I've seen it, the best in the industry, and they never talk about it, is Rockstar when it comes to this.
Really?
Yes,
I had no
you
idea.
never. I want to get like Lerner or somebody from Rockstar in here someday to talk about it, because I've never seen a team work so effectively. Where usually, especially with those big studios, you'll have people who focus on just the engine are here, and then people who focus on just this part of the game are here, but everybody that's working on that feature is together. Rockstar, anybody anywhere pretty much can be working on any other team. Like,
Interesting.
from what I can tell, like talking to people there, they're just, maybe some of it is they have like a programmer culture and everybody's kind of
Mm,
heads down, music
sure.
on. They're
Yep.
used to only communicating with emails or something. I don't know. I need to
Hmm.
dig into it. I need to figure out how they do it.
Yeah, I'd be very curious to know what their practical solutions are. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Well, I think this has gone on quite a bit. Thanks for hanging out with me, Chris.
Absolutely.
And we
This was a
didn't,
lot of fun.
it was, and we didn't get into like half the things I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to make you
All
come
right.
back
We
again
can
someday.
I'm happy to do so. Yeah, this was a blast.
Awesome. All right. Well, this has been Chris Reno. This has been Chris Remo.
Common mistake.
Reno. My bad.
Yeah.
Now, this has been Chris Remo and Gwen Frey, and you've been in the dialogue box. All right. That's where I'll cut it.
Cool.
And that'll be the podcast. And now we can stop ignoring the chat because I've
All
seen them
right.
been scrolling. Oh, quite a few people jumped in. I never changed the title, did I? Oh, you're William Cheer, according to the title.
Mm, another
Oops.
common mistake.
Yes. Hey guys, how are you? Let's give them a minute. Scroll up. Yeah. All right. I don't think they have questions, or at least they're being very quiet if they do.
Did we ever solicit questions? Do folks have any questions?
Oh, I guess we could tell them they could do that, yeah. Oh, man. Seems like the ideal of video game publishers is to be the kind of tech companies where they offer tools and services to projects under their umbrella, so a small studio could make a game that requires resources or skills beyond their scope. Um,
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that's kind of how Valve works in practice. Um, but I mean, it is one. Everyone is in the same building, so everything sort of does relate to everything else. But that is kind of how it feels in a sense, in that Valve has like just a bunch of in-house stuff, and then you just kind of have a bunch of different teams, and the teams are self-organizing. So like different teams at Valve work very different ways. Like some teams, the ones that like have older, I mean, this is not like a top-down like directive, but I mean there are just teams where more people have kids, and you can just tell the whole team kind of comes in earlier and goes home earlier. And there are some teams that are like super prototypey and they have their own way of working, and there's some teams that do all their communication via email, and there's some teams that do all their communication via IM, or like it's just and so it does kind of have that. There's a little bit of a feeling of that, and I can imagine a publisher working that way as well. But I'm less aware of what's going on in that sort of publisher world, I guess.
Perhaps. I mean, I know, like, definitely we reaped a lot of benefits for being part of 2K at Irrational. Like, there's a external
Mm.
mocap house
Oh, sure.
that's underneath the 2K umbrella, or we could pull in external devs from other places. I think
That
with
makes sense.
the thing with Valve, I've never really understood, because you guys don't hire people onto specific teams, right?
Correct. Yep.
So how does it like if the video people really really want a person to do a specific thing, like
Hmm.
how do they hire that person?
Um, so you don't hire people to onto a specific team, but you do hire people from a discipline, right? Like you do if you if 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 Valve really needed a video editor, if they needed more video editing than they had resources for, like we would still try and hire that person, right? I mean, I don't have really any connection to that particular team,
I
so I'm
get
not.
it. There's always
Uh-huh.
there's always the tasks that nobody wants to do, right? Like
Uh-huh.
who how do you convince somebody who's at Valve who could do anything they want to
Hmm.
write the build machine?
Oh, yeah, totally. That's a good question. So I probably will have a more like I would probably have a more in-depth, really crunchy answer for this after being there more than a year and a half. But the sense I get from that now is like if the it is true that you can do whatever. I mean, you can only literally whatever you want. You can't just like fuck around and expect people to actually respect you. But like, I mean, within reason, you can work on projects that you find to be valuable. But if people will ask other people for help, right? Like someone will go to another person and say, "Hey, look, we're working on this thing and we really need help on this thing and you seem like I've worked with you before or I've heard from folks who have worked with you before that you have the perfect skill set for this thing. It would really help us out if you did this." I just feel like the vibe is like you want to help people. Like you want it's true that no one it's true that there are tasks that people don't want to just only ever like do grunt work forever, but there's definitely tasks that may not be the most alluring tasks in the world, but you can tell because they will either say it or because it's just obvious. Like if I work on this thing, it would be truly helpful to these people and they would really appreciate it, and like that will end up benefiting you. Like if you're known as someone who does like solves a hard problem that is going to directly help someone else, it'll you'll genuinely feel appreciated for it. Like I don't really know how to put it, but it would be weird, it would just feel weird, I think, to consistently be refusing to help with something that you have direct skills and like time to be doing because you just don't feel like it. Like it would just be I don't
No,
know.
I get it. Like you're responsible. Like part of being
Yeah,
senior is being responsible, and Valve
yeah,
only hires
exactly.
senior people. I mean,
Yeah.
the in the beginning, the early days of the Molasses Flood, we were six incredibly senior people. We got it all done. Like things, nobody was. I mean, we all felt responsible for making sure the company did well. There was
Hmm.
so you did the work you had to do as well as the work that was interesting to you, and it worked out.
Yeah,
I
like
get it.
I've a thing I've done at every studio I've been at this point is like I always end up doing a bunch of web development stuff. That's not like my calling or anything. Like I mean, there are definitely times where I've felt like, man, this is a kind of a thankless task in a way because it's not the thing that a video game studio is created for. So almost necessarily, it's not the thing that most game developers care about. Like it's hard to get people to like get you the right assets that you need for the site you're working on or to like help you out on a thing or to get eyes on it because it's just not as interesting to people as actually working on the games. But I still have done it everywhere I've worked because it needs to get done and people are ultimately appreciative of it. um like if you don't have a website, like you need a website, right? So it's
Yeah.
like, all right, I'll just do that. And then and honestly it's been ultimately beneficial to me because that is where to the extent that I even am a programmer at all, it's because of learning like PHP and JavaScript to do web development. And again, I'm not like a deep low level engineer at all, like not at all.
Hey, you
But
did
those
C
those
plus plus.
principles, yeah. But I wasn't doing like engine programming, right? I was still
Mm.
doing gameplay. It was still gameplay programming. Um, but those principles that I learned in web development, like programming is programming kind of at the end of the day, again, unless you're doing really hardcore low level stuff, it all kind of is the same regardless of which language you're using. And so doing that task that was like less like amazing and seductive ended up still helping out the studio and also equipping me with the baseline for skills that ended up translating more directly to game development stuff that I use on an ongoing basis. So I guess my only answer to that question is just like you just do the stuff that's helpful and needs to be done because it's helpful and needs to be done, and you're, like you say, you're a basically responsible person. And it kind of ends up working out. Like it yeah, it just kind of
Oh
ends up working out.
yeah, like it all gets done for the most part. I
Yeah.
would say like, um, yeah, I know how that works. So long as everybody is senior, it changes once you have people of varying different levels. Where you're like, well, why doesn't the junior kid do the build machine stuff? Or what
Right,
are things
totally.
that tend
Yeah,
to
that's dangerous.
nobody? Once you get people who are different levels, it's very hard to convince any senior engineer that they're supposed to be doing UI work.
Yeah.
Like,
No, it's tough. I mean, that stuff is like that's a tough thing about managing like game teams. Yeah,
yeah.
for sure. Yeah.
Let's see. Let's get a couple more. What are your thoughts on Stadia, according to Zuck O?
So I'm not, I mean, obviously you are like deeply familiar with Stadia. I am not personally deeply familiar with Stadia. Is it out yet? Can we like
Two
try it
days.
2 days from now?
And
Okay.
it's like the
It has
rollout.
been out for 2 days, or it
No,
will
no,
be
no,
out in
no.
2 days?
It will be out. Oh,
It
shit.
will be
Is
out.
it 2 days?
Okay.
Let me look this up.
Okay. I mean,
What
I'm super
year is it?
curious about it. Um,
Yeah.
like I'm super curious generally. I think that there doesn't seem like there's it doesn't seem possible that that kind of thing won't be pretty normal eventually, right? Like eventually we're gonna have some kind of just stream, whether it's Stadia or not specifically. Like everything else now is delivered that way. All the other entertainment
Hmm.
that we enjoy comes to us streamed from some huge server farm somewhere. So I can't possibly imagine why games wouldn't eventually also, I mean, games are technically, like at a fundamental level, are technically different to music and film and television and books,
Hmm.
but so they, it might not be exactly the same, but I just can't imagine that that's not going to be a significant force in some factor. Like we've been messing around with that stuff at Valve too. Like we released I wasn't involved with this personally at all, but we released a feature about a month ago that lets you play local multiplayer games together on the internet by basically doing a very similar thing to what Stadia is doing, right? Like you're streaming the end rendered result to your friend's computer so that both of you can see the same thing and play
One
split
of
screen or whatever together.
I didn't know much about
Um,
this. One person's the host though, right?
yeah, so
As
it's
opposed
it's
to yeah.
different because it's like, but I mean I guess what I just mean is like the underlying sort of technical underpinnings I assume are similar. Like they're both I mean, one of them is obviously the entire platform is that, and the other is like this is sort of a fun feature to help people get more value out of the games that they own. But they're both they're both like dealing with this general concept of like streaming a fully rendered, game experience from one place to another.
Hmm.
And I just feel like that it certainly is going to continue to be more relevant.
Yeah, and that's another step. I think Valve's first step, I would argue, was actually before you guys have something where you can. I know, I only know this because I use it sometimes. If I have a game
It's a good
running on,
reason to know it.
yeah, if I have a game running on my computer and like my boyfriend's playing something downstairs, I'll go downstairs and I'll get on my laptop, and rather than install the game,
Hmm.
I can just stream it from my computer
Yeah.
to my laptop.
As the same people. I mean, will not be surprising to you, but yeah, it's basically the same people inside Valve uh, who did that. There's a
Mm.
guy, Sam, who was a big spearhead of that thing that you're talking about, the in-home streaming, and a lot of that tech would just like went right into the play together stuff.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
Stadia's the difference with Stadia is that they're. I mean, there's a million differences, and I should be
Of course,
careful
of
about what
course.
to say because I don't want to get in trouble
No,
again.
no, no, totally, yeah.
But the like the difference with Stadia, like the reason why it's billions and billions of dollars is because they're building up their server architecture basically. Like
Mm,
the Google's big thing is they're also like a massive enterprise cloud. What do you call it? They're like one of the bigger cloud. They have the best cloud. I'm the stupidest person. I'm the
yeah, I
stupidest
don't know.
person. But
I
like
don't know that much about this stuff. Yeah.
they just have way more data centers than everybody else, and
Of course, yeah,
they're
that's their whole
expanding it.
deal. Yeah.
And some of a lot of the Stadia stuff is like a lot of their new data centers are rather than they're changing what's in those data centers to be
Hmm.
kind of Stadia data centers. So they're better off for
Got it.
streaming video games, that sort of thing.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
This
Yeah.
is why I hired Elmore to do the port, because I don't know the words good. But the idea is that the game is running on in the cloud and streamed rather than
Yeah, yeah,
being
yeah.
somewhere
Exactly.
in your
Yeah.
house.
But I mean, but in the cloud just means on a computer somewhere, right? Like it's still fundamentally basically the same thing. It's just there obviously the scale with Stadia and Google is just obviously massive compared to anyone else pretty much. Maybe at
Yeah,
Amazon. I don't know.
Amazon's got a lot of cloud infrastructure as well. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean a couple people do.
Yeah.
Microsoft is starting. I don't know the exactly who's winning as far as like enterprise cloud infrastructure
God,
goes.
I haven't the slightest clue.
Like
I
I'm
wouldn't even know where to begin.
That's web stuff. If
Yeah.
Stadia becomes self-aware and turns on the human race, how can we convert the Steam store? What? Hey, Port Pocky,
How can
what's
we
up?
convert the Steam store into a mech to fight it? I haven't the slightest clue. But I would imagine someone at Valve is probably working on that problem as we speak.
I would hope so.
There's like a whole floor at Valve that's the hardware floor, and there's a big sign that says that it's like there's like an on off light that's like beware of laser, and it looks like a joke, like it looks like a goofy nerd joke, that's like watch out for the laser. Nope, there's actually a huge fucking super powerful laser in that room, and you do have to watch out when it's on because it'll blind you.
Why?
Um,
Why do you have a big laser at
I
Valve?
it honestly I don't even know. I assume it has something to do with like measuring like alignment of like we have CNC machines and stuff in there for hardware prototypes. Like the obviously actual manufacturing happens in a factory, but like we can produce prototypes of hardware in the studio, and I there's all kinds of crazy equipment that I don't know how to use that people use for that stuff. So I assume the laser uh, is related to all of that.
This is
But it
nuts.
was that was a funny thing that I remember seeing and being like laser, like it's like one of those words that it's so abused by pop culture that it like has lost its valence as an actual scientific term. Um, but yeah, I guess people use lasers for work.
Do you know everything that's being developed at Valve, or is it just like there's too many
Um,
things?
yeah, I mean, I think I probably do, but that doesn't mean I'm like deeply aware of what's going on with all those
Well,
things,
of
right? Like, I
course, yeah.
mean, you run into people in the hall and talk about what they're doing, but there's like I mean, there's definitely projects where I just don't like. I mean, for instance, Counter Strike is still under like active development, like yeah, which is not. Again, this is something that before I got to Valve, I it's like, well, I haven't played Counter Strike in eight. I was never a big Counter Strike person in the first place, so I already it's not surprising that I wasn't aware of what's going on with Counter Strike. But getting there, I'm like, oh, there's like a whole team of people just still working on Counter Strike, and they're just super into Counter Strike, and they want to make Counter Strike better. I have no idea what's going on with it. Not because I like not because it's a secret. It's just there's there's so many different things going on. I'm like just I guess they're doing Counter Strike. That's cool.
I mean, that's a huge part of Valve's revenue is still their games. It's Dota 2, Counter Strike.
Yeah, yeah. So
Like,
like Dota 2, and then a bunch of people who worked on Dota 2 split off to make Underlords, which I worked on for a few months, kind of
you
to
mentioned
kind of
that. I
yeah.
didn't want to sound stupid. Is that Valve's answer to auto chess?
Yes, yes, it
Got it.
is.
Yeah. Okay.
Precisely. Yep. Yep. Which is fun. I like it. I actually like it a lot. I have played Dota like a few times, but it is way beyond me. Like I'm not a super competitive multiplayer person really. The really the only time in my life I got into competitive multiplayer was with my friend Nick Brecken. He and I played 2v2 StarCraft and got into the like platinum leagues or whatever, StarCraft 2. But other than that, I've never been a real and so Dota 2 is like it's Dota 2 is in that top tier of mega competitive games that it's just beyond my comprehension.
Yeah.
So Dota Underlords has for me has been really fun because it's like okay, it's not actually the same game at all. Like it's called Dota Underlords and it's based on a Dota mod, but it's so much more comprehensible
It's
to me.
it's closer to auto
Um,
chess, right? It's
yeah,
the
it doesn't require any reflexes, like it's I mean there's time limits because there's a clock ticking down, so you only have a limited amount of time to make your decisions, but you don't there's no like wrist flicking like management, whatever. It's it's a bit of a more it's a much more chill experience. And there's a duos mode, so you can play it with another friend. So it's two v2 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 v2, which I like. I like that. So I really enjoy two-player competitive multiplayer stuff because it just I get less personally stressed out. So yeah, that's it's an auto chess game, but it's changed a lot since then. It's like evolved a lot since the it started as basically like, all right, let's make auto chess but not a mod. Let's make auto chess but like runs natively in the engine. But since then, it's diverged a lot, just in the way that any game design eventually does.
Yeah, of course. You start in a space and you see where it goes.
Yep.
All right, what else we got going on here? The AWS is primarily competing in tech. As far as I know, they are bigger. GCPs. Google is late to the party. Azure is dominating the market. I suspect I don't know shit
This
about
is not
stuff.
something that we don't know anything about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Someone, what is this? Someone, Fetragon said, "Are there any platforms where Chris is available for conversation?" I'm not necessarily sure I understand what that question means. Like, I have a Twitter account, if that's what you mean, which is just Chris Remo, but I'm not sure what that question is asking exactly.
Does Valve have a Discord? I'd imagine somehow that feels weird.
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think so. I mean, there might be like, I'm sure that there are just Steam community, like people from Steam community with Discords, but I don't think there's any official one.
Is Idle Thumbs gonna come back someday, Chris Remo?
That's a really good question.
Does
I
like
wish I knew the answer to that.
does Valve have a non compete? Like,
No, there's no. We didn't. We're not doing the podcast because of Valve. Um, it's so basically when we were in. So a thing about Idle Thumbs, we always really liked when we started Idle Thumbs originally in 2008. We at the time, if people can remember, podcasts were really they were super non-professional compared to what they're like now. So at the time, it was like I would say a lot of podcasts were, um, Skype based, things like that, and we really wanted to do a video game podcast by people with perspective on the video game industry, where we were always all in the same room and we did it regularly, and it was like, you know, as sort of, I guess, legit as we could make it, even though it was always obviously it was never like part of a bigger company or anything. And so we really, that was really important. And so when I left San Francisco to go to Boston to work at Irrational, we stopped doing the podcast in large part because I wasn't physically going to be there anymore. Um, well, actually, that first happened when Nick left to go to Bethesda, and then we did stop doing the podcast because we're like, well, we don't really want to do it with him remotely because that we feel like that would kind of hurt the vibe. So we just stopped doing it entirely, and then we started it up again with Steve Gaynor as Nick's replacement because we could do it in the same room still because he was in the Bay Area, and then Sean Vanneman, who was on it as a guest occasionally, and then when I left, then it was like, okay, I guess it's over again. And I kind of went through that a few times, and now Nick is in Vancouver, and Jake and I are in Seattle, and the just geographically. So one, it's already a bummer. Like we did do it with Nick being remote. We did both Idle Thumbs and Important If True with Nick remote when we were still in San Francisco. But that was already like pushing against the like edge of what we actually felt comfortable doing with the podcast. And now that Jake and I are in Seattle, it's even harder. Like in San Francisco, we had an actual dedicated studio space. Like when we did the Idle Thumbs Kickstarter in 2012, that gave us enough money to actually rent an office for Idle Thumbs, which we did. So we had a dedicated permanent office space for Idle Thumbs. It was very small, but it was dedicated. And then when Campo started, Idle Thumbs subleased a room in Campo. So Idle Thumbs still had its own dedicated office and studio space, and we just don't have. We have tried, like Jake and I have tried to figure out what the equivalent of that in Seattle is, and just the way Seattle's much more, it's much physically bigger than San Francisco. It's a
Mm-hmm.
smaller population, but it's a bigger physical area. And Jake and I live like on opposite sides of the city, and then that our workplace where we both work is in a different city on the other side of the water. Um, so we just haven't been able to, and also all of the like the equivalent of the sort of cheap studio space that you we could get in, like in San Francisco we had a cheap Idle Thumbs rented a cheap office in the Mission, and the equivalent of that kind of cheap small studio space in Seattle is just in a different, in a totally different part of town that is the opposite direction from where Valve is, where we work. So just trying to figure out like how we would actually make this work. And then also on top of that, Nick is remote anyway. Like, this is boring. I'm going to stop talking because I'm just
Yeah.
blathering at this point. But like, it's just, I don't know. We just couldn't figure out any way to actually make it good,
Yeah.
and sustainable. And we didn't want to like start it and then do like 2 episodes and be like, then have a 3 week gap and then do another, like we wanted to either like solve it and do it, or not, and we're in the not currently because we just haven't been able to figure out how to consistently normally do it. But someone in chat actually points out, this is a good point, Nick has been streaming regularly through the Idle Thumbs Twitch channel. So if you want at least Nick Brecken on a regular basis, he has a Patreon, patreon.com/Brecken, and he's streaming like pretty much every day, I think, at twitch.tv/Idle Thumbs. So one of us is like regularly
Is
broadcasting.
he streaming right now? Maybe we should host him.
Oh, is he streaming right this second?
I don't know. Let me see.
Oh,
What
okay.
did you say
I,
his
I
name
have no
was?
idea if he is or not. No, I think he's offline right now.
This version,
But he
people
does.
can even have his
I
fear
think he
dreams.
does actually stream every day. Like he did the thing you kind of have to do, which is he started a Patreon, which now means people are paying money for what he's doing, which means he actually has to do it like every day.
Mm.
So he's keeping himself honest by being paid. So if you're interested in Nick Brecken streaming, which he is a good, funny streaming presence. He does that. Someone in chat says every weekday, which is correct. Yeah, every weekday.
Got it. All right. So we should check him out. I think I'm going to roll off of here.
Cool.
Thanks for hanging out, everybody, and thanks for
Yeah. Thanks,
being.
everyone.
Yeah, if you ever want to be on this again, I know this is a not as frequent. I often go 3 weeks without streaming, and we're doing
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
over a
Of
Skype
course.
chat. But if you're down for it, you're always welcome here on the Dialogue
Yeah.
Box.
No. No. Anytime. I will be happy to come back.
And I think we will do this as much as you want to until Idle Thumbs, because eventually Idle Thumbs is coming back.
I hope it
Like,
comes back in some form for sure. I mean, it's been a part of my life since 2003 in several different forms. And it's definitely one of my favorite things I've ever worked on. So I do hope it comes back.
all right. Well, thanks for chatting with me, and goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Bye, Gwen.
Later.